Evan Cross didn't realize he had become a problem until the problem started correcting him. It began with a delay. Not a denial, not a warning, just a delay that didn't make sense. His background check for a consulting contract stalled in a system that usually cleared within hours. Then a second delay followed, and a third. The automated emails were polite, almost apologetic, citing verification backlog and routine cross-referencing. Evan had spent 10 years inside compliance frameworks, data governance, and risk mitigation. He knew what routine looked like. This wasn't it. Evan was 37, a former state-level auditor who'd left public service after testifying against a procurement board that had quietly funneled millions into shell contractors. The case never went to trial. It never needed to. 2 resignations, 1 sealed settlement, and a press cycle that died in 48 hours. Evan had been congratulated privately for doing the right thing, then slowly excluded from anything that mattered. He adapted. That's what people like him do. He moved into private consulting, advising mid-size firms on regulatory exposure. Clean work, necessary work, invisible work. He kept his head down and his language neutral. No cruzats, no vistlebloin. Just structure. So when the delays began, he assumed incompetence. Then his access badge failed at a building he'd visited weekly for 2 years. Security was apologetic. System update, they said. Happens sometimes. They signed him in manually, but he noticed something odd. His name didn't populate automatically on the visitor screen. The guard typed it in by hand, hesitated, then glanced at Evan a fraction of a second too long. That look stayed with him. The next week, a bank flagged his account for unusual activity. There wasn't any. He knew because he monitored everything obsessively. Still, the freeze lasted 48 hours. When it lifted, no explanation followed, just a bland confirmation that the review had concluded. Evan began documenting, not emotionally, structurally, dates, times, systems involved, response latency. He built a private log, the same way he'd once tracked irregularities in state procurement. Patterns emerged quickly. The triggers weren't random. They clustered around specific actions. Applying for contracts tied to government-adjacent firms, requesting expedited clearances, accessing certain public records. Felt less like surveillance and more like friction. Like someone had turned the resistance knob up just enough to be noticed. The first explicit signal arrived in the form of a letter. Not an email. Not a notification. A letter. It was addressed correctly, printed on heavy stock, with no return address. Inside was a single page. Notice of Data Integrity Review. This is not an accusation. This is not an investigation. No action is required at this time. That was it. No contact number. No explanation. Evan read it 3 times, then laughed once, short and dry. He recognized the language instantly. It was designed to neutralize response, to create awareness without offering engagement. A legal gray zone perfected over decades. He considered ignoring it. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since leaving public service. He pulled threads. Using professional contacts, Evan began asking quiet questions. Not about himself, never about himself, but about the systems. He framed it as academic curiosity, policy review, hypotheticals. He learned that several federal agencies had quietly consolidated risk assessment functions under shared integrity platforms, ostensibly to reduce redundancy. In practice, it meant data once siloed now spoke fluently across domains. Legal, financial, employment, licensing. A dropped charge in one system no longer stayed dropped elsewhere. It echoed. Evan cross-referenced this with his own history, the testimony, the sealed settlement, the internal memos he'd never been allowed to see. He wasn't flagged as criminal. He was flagged as destabilizing. That realization landed heavily. Destabilizing actors didn't require punishment. They required containment. The next escalation was subtle but unmistakable. A consulting firm withdrew an offer without explanation. A landlord asked for updated documentation despite a spotless payment history. His professional liability insurance premium doubled overnight. Each incident taken alone was defensible. Together, they formed a pressure system. Evan requested his data. Under federal law, he was entitled to it, or so he thought. The responses were fragmented. Some agencies complied partially. Others redirected him. One denied holding any records at all, contradicting prior correspondence. When he pushed back, carefully citing statutes, the tone shifted. We are unable to process repeated requests that may interfere with operational continuity. Operational continuity. That phrase appeared again and again. Evan realized something chilling. Every attempt to clarify his status increased the friction. The system wasn't reacting emotionally. It was recalibrating. So he changed approach. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he applied. He submitted applications to roles he was vastly overqualified for. Entry-level compliance positions. Temporary analyst contracts. Roles designed to be cleared automatically. Each application disappeared into silence. Except one. A nonprofit consultancy affiliated with a federal pilot program responded within hours. The interview was brief, impersonal, almost scripted. The offer came the same day. The role was titled External Systems Liaison. The description was vague. The pay was modest. The access level, however, was unprecedented. Evan accepted. On his first day, he was issued credentials that opened dashboards he'd only heard about in theory. Aggregated risk profiles.
Behavioral trend overlays.
Predictive compliance scoring. And there it was. His name. Not highlighted. Not red-flagged. Just present. With a score beside it. The score wasn't labeled. No scale.
No explanation.
But Evan didn't need one. He understood immediately. He wasn't being evaluated for what he'd done. He was being evaluated for what he might do. And the system had decided that probability was unacceptable. As Evan stared at the screen, a realization cut through him with surgical clarity. This wasn't about stopping crimes. It was about preemptively managing people who caused institutional discomfort. And now, by stepping inside, Evan had crossed a line he might never be able to step back from. Evan didn't scroll at first. He just stared at the number beside his name, letting the realization finish forming. The score pulsed faintly, updating in real time as if it were alive, responding to invisible inputs. Somewhere, a system he had never agreed to be part of was actively deciding how much friction his future could tolerate. He forced himself to move. Scrolling revealed others. Hundreds of profiles, anonymized at first glance, but patterns were unmistakable. Former regulators, journalists who had pivoted to consulting, analysts who had resigned instead of complying. None of them were criminals. None of them were celebrated whistleblowers either. They existed in the uncomfortable middle space, people who had proven they could disrupt without breaking laws. The interface didn't use words like threat or risk. It used variance, deviation, instability index. Evan understood the brilliance of it immediately. Moral language invited debate. Statistical language shut it down. Over the next weeks, his role became clearer, not through explanation but through exposure. He wasn't there to make decisions. He was there to observe alignment, to flag anomalies in behavior before they turned into action. The system didn't care what someone believed. It cared about what they were likely to do when incentives shifted. Every morning, Evan reviewed activity deltas, people whose access patterns changed, whose communication frequency spiked, whose applications crossed unusual boundaries. None of it was illegal. That was the point. One name appeared repeatedly. A woman in her early 40s, former compliance attorney, fired quietly after challenging a risk model that disproportionately excluded certain contractors. Her score had climbed steadily over 6 months. Nothing dramatic, just enough to trigger a monitoring threshold. Evan clicked deeper. She'd applied for a housing loan. Delayed. A professional certification renewal. Under review. A speaking engagement. Cancelled without explanation. The system labeled it adaptive containment. Evan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This wasn't hypothetical anymore. This was a mirror. He flagged the case for review, not as an objection but as a technical inquiry. Within minutes, a message arrived. No action required. Case within acceptable parameters. That phrase again. Acceptable parameters. Evan began to notice something else. His own score fluctuated based on his internal behavior. Time spent viewing certain profiles. Frequency of data exports. Even cursor hesitation registered as microsignals. The system wasn't just monitoring subjects. It was monitoring monitors. Late one evening, alone in the office, Evan tested a theory. He pulled up his own profile and initiated a mock query. Nothing external, just internal simulation. The score dipped slightly. The system interpreted curiosity as intent. He logged out and sat back, suddenly aware of how quiet the room was. No cameras were visible, but he knew better than to assume absence meant safety. Systems like this didn't need constant observation. They relied on correlation. The next escalation came without ceremony. His role expanded. He was invited to a closed session. No calendar entry, no recording, where senior analysts discussed edge stabilization. The language was clean, bloodless. People were resources. Outcomes were curves. Evan listened as one analyst described a successful containment scenario where a subject gradually lost professional relevance over 3 years, eventually self-selecting into lower-impact work. No intervention required, the analyst concluded. Natural attrition. Evan realized with a chill that the system didn't just punish. It waited. Patience was its most powerful weapon. After the meeting, a man approached Evan quietly, mid-50s, polite, not senior enough to intimidate, not junior enough to ignore. "First time?" the man asked. Evan nodded. "Don't worry," the man said. "It gets easier once you stop thinking in terms of fairness." That night, Evan went home and opened his private log again. The one he'd started when the delays began. He added new entries now, internal ones. Processes, thresholds, response loops. He realized something critical. The system wasn't centralized. It was modular, distributed across agencies, vendors, contractors. No single kill switch, no single authority. Accountability dissolved by design, which meant exposure wouldn't work. Court wouldn't work. Even journalism wouldn't work, not without evidence that could survive fragmentation. Evan needed leverage. He found it accidentally. While reviewing historical data migrations, he noticed legacy records marked as non-conforming. These were old cases pre-integration where individuals had been flagged under outdated criteria. Many of them had never been updated. Their scores were frozen in time. Ghosts in the system. Evan ran a comparison. Some of these individuals were now in positions of power. Their scores, if recalculated, would spike dangerously. The system hadn't updated them because doing so would destabilize itself. That was the first crack Evan had seen. He didn't act on it immediately. He waited. He observed. He learned how thresholds were enforced and, more importantly, how exceptions were justified. Then he did something subtle. He initiated a routine integrity check. One that required recalculation. The impact wasn't immediate. It never was. But somewhere deep in the system, dormant profiles stirred. Scores updated. Alerts queued. And for the first time since stepping inside, Evan saw genuine hesitation ripple through the dashboards. Not fear. Concern. Within hours, his access narrowed slightly. Nothing overt. Just enough to signal awareness. Evan smiled for the first time in months. They had noticed, which meant they could be pressured. But Evan also understood the cost. He wasn't fighting a villain. He was challenging an ecosystem that had evolved to survive scrutiny. If he pushed too hard, he wouldn't be punished. He would be absorbed, reclassified, neutralized. Evan looked at his reflection in the darkened monitor and made a decision that would define what came next. He would not expose the system. He would force it to choose between stability and itself. The shift didn't come with confrontation, came with precision. Evan noticed it on a Tuesday morning when his dashboard failed to load one of the legacy datasets he'd flagged days earlier. No error message.
No denial.
Just a quiet absence where data used to be. He checked permissions. Everything appeared unchanged. Yet the dataset was gone, collapsed into a summarized node, stripped of identifiers and historical depth. Someone had intervened, not to stop him outright, to blunt the edge. By noon, his calendar was full. Meetings he hadn't requested. Check-ins framed as collaboration. Senior analysts suddenly interested in his perspective. He recognized the maneuver instantly, inclusion as containment. One of them, a man named Callahan, spoke openly in a way that felt rehearsed. "You're clearly talented," Callahan said. "We value independent thinkers. But independence works best when it aligns with long-term stability." Evan nodded, saying nothing. Callahan continued. "You've uncovered some structural artifacts. That's impressive. But recalibrating legacy data indiscriminately can create unintended consequences." "For whom?" Evan asked. Callahan smiled thinly. "For everyone." The next day, Evan's score dropped. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. He watched the number tick downward as his access privileges were adjusted in parallel. Certain export functions disabled. Certain visualizations simplified. The system didn't accuse him of wrongdoing. It responded to him as a variable drifting out of tolerance. He went home that night and slept badly, waking to the dull certainty that something irreversible had begun. The pressure escalated socially. Colleagues stopped sitting near him. Conversations ended when he entered rooms. Not out of fear, out of instruction. He wasn't radioactive. He was inefficient. An internal memo circulated under the guise of a productivity initiative. It emphasized streamlined collaboration paths and reduced variance in analytical approaches. Evan recognized it for what it was, a warning disguised as optimization. He received a private message later that day from the man who'd spoken to him after the first closed session. "Be careful. You're approaching a point where the system protects itself reflexively." Evan typed a response, deleted it, then typed another. "What happens then?" The reply came hours later. "People like you stop being variables and start being constraints." That night, Evan ran simulations. Not on the system servers, on his own isolated environment. He reconstructed the logic he'd observed, modeling how the integrity platform responded to internal stressors. What he found was worse than he expected. The system didn't collapse under pressure. It rerouted. When destabilized, it sacrificed nodes, roles, departments, even individuals to preserve the core. Those sacrifices were justified post hoc as efficiency gains. Evan wasn't a threat. He was a candidate. The realization sharpened his focus. If he was going to force a choice, it had to be binary. No slow bleed. No incremental exposure. The system needed to face a scenario it couldn't optimize around without revealing itself. He found it in the recalculation protocol. There was a failsafe buried deep in the documentation, a clause designed for catastrophic data corruption. In such cases, the system was required to temporarily suspend automated enforcement and defer to human oversight. It had never been triggered. Evan understood why. Triggering it would require a convergence of conditions the system actively avoided. But avoided didn't mean impossible. Over weeks, he engineered it carefully, not by injecting false data, not by breaking rules, by complying. He submitted perfectly valid queries that, when combined, forced contradictory outputs. Edge cases stacked upon edge cases until the predictive confidence intervals overlapped in ways the system couldn't resolve autonomously. Warnings began appearing. Confidence scores dipped below acceptable thresholds. Analysts scrambled, recalibrating models, narrowing parameters. Evan kept going. On a Thursday evening, the dashboard flickered. A red indicator appeared for the first time Evan had ever seen. Automated enforcement suspended. Human review required. The room went silent. Within minutes, Evan's access was severed completely. Not downgraded. Not limited. Gone. His phone buzzed with simultaneous notifications. Security revocation, administrative leave, pending review. The speed was staggering. They moved fast when cornered. 2 men were waiting for him at the building exit. Not security. Not police. Just men in neutral jackets with practiced expressions. "We need you to come with us," one said. Evan didn't resist. He knew resistance would only validate their framing. The room they took him to was unremarkable.
No interrogación lights.
No recording devices in sight. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a woman he recognized immediately. The same one from his first days inside. "You caused instability," she said calmly. "I followed the rules," Evan replied. "Yes," she said. "That's why this is serious." She explained it without anger, without threat. The system had been forced into a state it was never meant to enter. Human oversight meant accountability. Accountability meant exposure, not public, but internal. Careers were at risk. Reputations. The architecture itself. "You created a scenario where we had to see ourselves," she said. "We don't appreciate that." Evan leaned forward. "Then shut it down." She almost smiled. "You still think there's an off switch," she said. "There isn't." She slid a document across the table. It wasn't a non-disclosure agreement. It was a transition plan. A role outside the platform but adjacent to it. A consultancy with no authority and complete insulation. A generous compensation package.
Permanent.
"You'll be comfortable," she said. "Irrelevant, but comfortable." "And if I refuse?" Evan asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Then the system will reassert equilibrium," she said finally. "And you will experience that reassertion personally." Evan understood what she meant.
No arrest.
No charges. Just cascading friction until he couldn't function. He looked at the document, at the numbers, at the silence behind her eyes. The system had made its choice. Now it was asking him to make his. Evan didn't sign the document immediately. He asked for time, knowing full well that time itself was a concession the system rarely granted. The woman hesitated, then nodded once. 48 hours, she said. "After that, the offer expires." "What happens then?" Evan asked. She didn't look at him when she answered. "Then we stop pretending you're a special case." They escorted him out through a side exit.
No handcuffs. No guards.
Just a quiet return to the city, where people hurried past unaware that a man nearby had just triggered a contingency no one was supposed to see. For the first 12 hours, nothing happened. That was almost worse. Evan went home, sat at his desk, and tried to think like the system. Not emotionally, mechanically. If he refused, they wouldn't retaliate immediately. Retaliation created narratives. Instead, they would let the friction resume. Faster now, unrestrained. He tested the edges. His phone service still worked. His bank account was still accessible. But when he tried to schedule a medical appointment he'd postponed for months, the earliest available slot was suddenly 6 months away. When he logged into a professional forum he'd moderated for years, his account showed limited posting privileges pending verification.
No explanation.
No appeal. By morning, the effects compounded. His email provider flagged unusual activity and temporarily locked him out. His rideshare app declined his payment method. His building's digital lock required reauthentication. Each incident was small, plausible, dismissible. Together, they formed a map. The system wasn't punishing him. It was withdrawing support. Evan realized then what the offer truly was. Not a reward. A life raft. A way to exist within acceptable margins rather than be slowly pushed outside them. He spent the next day doing something dangerous. He talked to people. Not journalists. Not activists. Friends. Former colleagues. Old contacts. Most conversations ended politely but quickly. People were busy, distracted, uncomfortable. A few didn't respond at all. One person, a former analyst he trusted, answered honestly. "I can't get involved," the man said quietly. "My risk profile can't take it." Evan didn't blame him. That was the genius of it.
No villains. No threats.
Just incentives aligned so cleanly that resistance felt irrational. By the evening of the second day, Evan's access to his own data was gone entirely. Requests bounced. Portals timed out. Systems he'd used daily now treated him like a stranger. At 11:37 p.m., his phone buzzed. A single message. Offer expires in 23 minutes. Evan stared at the document one last time. The language was immaculate. No mention of silence.
No explicit restrictions.
Just obligations framed as stability clauses, conflict of interest provisions, and non-interference standards. He could live well. He could disappear gently. He signed. The confirmation arrived instantly. Transition accepted. Status realigned. The change was immediate. His phone stabilized. His access returned not fully, but sufficiently. Appointments opened up. Holds lifted. Friction eased. It was like exhaling after being underwater too long. The consultancy role was exactly as described. Adjacent. Advisory. Toothless. He attended meetings where his insights were acknowledged and then quietly ignored. He was consulted after decisions were made. Never before. His score remained visible to him now. Lower. Stable. Safe. Months passed. Evan watched from the margins as the system continued to function, refined by the lessons he had inadvertently provided. New safeguards appeared. New thresholds. Better insulation against internal disruption. His name no longer appeared in active datasets. He had become resolved. Sometimes, late at night, Evan wondered what would have happened if he'd refused. If he'd forced the system to follow through on its promise of equilibrium. But he understood now. There would have been no dramatic collapse. No public reckoning. Just a slow narrowing until his life no longer intersected meaningfully with anything that mattered. People didn't vanish in this system. They faded. Years later, Evan read about a minor policy revision buried deep in a federal report. A clause about variance absorption mechanisms. He recognized his own fingerprints in the language. He closed the document and sat back, feeling something between pride and nausea. The system had learned. From him. And somewhere out there, another person was probably noticing their first unexplained delay. Their first stalled application. Their first quiet signal that they were becoming inconvenient. Evan wished he could warn them, but he also knew the truth. By the time you realize you're fighting the system, you're already inside it, and it has already decided how much of you it can afford to keep.